Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this really wonderful discussion. The Ocean Has Rhythm, 4 centuries of musical travels across the Atlantic and the circuits of sound it created. First, I'd like to thank UCI Oceans Project Director, Judy Wu, the Oceans Project, Ryan Gurney, Amanda Swain, Michelle Spivey, and everyone else at the UCI Humanities Center and Department of History who made this possible. Dean Tyrus Miller of the School of Humanities for supporting this. My colleagues at the UCI Department of History who've allowed me to go wandering around Africa all these years, discovering great music, and also the Global Jazz Studies program at UCLA's Herb Alpert School of Music, who are pioneering the inter and transdisciplinary future of music, in my opinion, and even more important, perhaps, music and humanistic pedagogy with all of their amazing programs. I also want to begin by recognizing that all the beautiful music we're going to talk about today is tragically the result of immeasurable blood, violence, and oppression for millions of Africans stolen from their homes and brought across the Atlantic to the Western Hemisphere, to the millions of indigenous Americans who were exterminated or lost their territories and cultures because of European colonization, and the millions of Africans who also suffered under European colonial and then authoritarian post-colonial successor states at home. So all of the music we're talking about could not have existed without all of this suffering. On the other hand, though, I can't help wondering, first of all, how much more amazing these musical meetings that we're going to talk about might have been if all these cross-cultural meetings occurred without all this violence, dehumanization, and exploitation. And secondly, I'm always thinking every day as a musician and a scholar and someone who tries to work for social justice, how, as Fela Kuti famously said, we can make music into an even more powerful weapon in the struggles for freedom and survival as we face all the existential challenges before us. And whether we're looking at Palestine today or what's happening now in Nigeria that's just started another potential civil war, or elsewhere in Africa or so many other places, we have a lot of challenges. Here, I just want to give a very brief introduction to our panelists. Their full biographies and such are on the webpage that will be on your chat for everyone watching, so you can learn more about all of us that way. The first time I went to sub-Saharan Africa was thanks almost entirely to the incredible energy of Professor Ama Wray, our co-panelist today, as well as our colleagues, Professor Jessica Millward and Cecilia Lynch and other UCI profs who organized a once-in-a-lifetime trip for UCI dance students and me to work with the Ghana Dance Ensemble in Accra, an exchange program I wish every day could return. There were 2 people I had come to Ghana specifically to meet. One was high life and Afrobeat legend Abel Taylor, perhaps the only person on this earth besides James Brown who could give Fela some competition for outright funkiness. And the other was Abel's longtime friend, and I would soon learn, guitarist extraordinaire, Professor John Collins of the University of Ghana-Legon. And now I would be remiss not to point out a member of the Ghana Academy of Sciences, one of only 100 members. But as was still common even a decade ago, when I reached Prof. Collins, he told me he had a bad case of malaria and would probably not be able to meet while I was there for 2 or 3 weeks. Thankfully, he got better, and we were ultimately able to meet. And I think it was your first night out, Prof. Collins, since you got sick, at the Goethe Institute in Accra, where an amazing troupe of drummers from the Muslim north of Ghana were performing. That was my introduction in rhythm to what Prof. Collins so well explains in all his books and writings, the incredibly complex and hybrid nature of the music, its roots and its many routes that ultimately created high life and Afro-funk and all the other genres we'll discuss today. It was Prof. Collins' discussion of the musical circuits that began to be created with the first slave ships to cross the Atlantic, and then the warships that took freed but often conscripted Africans back to Africa, that helped me understand that globalization is not a contemporary phenomenon, but rather at the heart of a process that has gone on for 5 centuries. I'm so happy to finally be able to share this wisdom with everyone, but even more so because of the 4 people who are with us today. Arturo O'Farrill, a professor at UCLA's Global Jazz Studies program, is a 7-time Grammy winner and undoubtedly one of the finest pianists alive, and equally important, one of the greatest teachers I know from personal experience. I always wanted to put him together with Prof. Collins because his Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra is in so many ways the musical embodiment of the roots and routes that Professor Collins' work has so well elaborated. My favorite music, however, is funk. And if there is no one on earth funkier than Fela, then there's no one on earth who knows as much about funk, its histories, and its ties to American cultural, political, and racial histories and struggles as Professor Scot Brown of the Department of African American Studies at UCLA. Besides his numerous articles and books on funk and African American radical politics, his work on the film Finding the Funk is without a doubt one of the great explorations of the music I've ever encountered. The feel and vibrations and movement associated with the rhythms of the music we're discussing are, of course, as important as the melodies. And as I already mentioned, the person who introduced me to all of these on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa was Ama Wray, professor of dance at UCI, and one of the most innovative and powerful imaginers of the relationship between African and American systems of movement I've ever met. And finally, I'm really excited to have our newest colleague at UCI's Department of History, Professor Rasul Miller, here with us. Professor Miller recently completed his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania and then did a postdoc at Yale before coming here, and is breaking really important new ground on the African-American cultural and musical diasporas and political diasporas returning to the motherland, especially to what is today Senegal and other parts of West Africa. To have you all together is something I know no one watching or listening, and certainly I will ever forget. So let me turn it over to you, Prof. Collins, and when you're done, we'll go around to everyone for comments and thoughts, and then open it up to discussion amongst ourselves and the audience, who will have the opportunity to ask questions on the Q&A function on this Zoom webinar. So over to you, Prof. Collins.
Thank you. Okay, what I'm going to do, I've got half an hour, so this I've done a lot of editing. I'm going to try to take if you can see the picture, the diagrammatic picture here of the relationship between the two sides of the Atlantic in terms of music, and dance. Music and dance is what I'll be discussing, mainly music. We're really talking about the return journey. Most people will know that Bob Marley, I don't know, let's say hip hop and so on, is popular in Africa today, and particularly in Ghana right now, dancehall from Jamaica. And I think you're going to talk about funk and Latin music, pushing the envelope back in time. But I want to push the story back 210 years, or I'll start there, that this return cycle of music from descendants of African slaves, and in fact, sometimes African slaves themselves, actually was able to return miraculously to Africa. And it's been going on for 210 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Gome music. So this is what this is. Gome, or Gumbe, as it's known in the West Indies. In Ghana, it's known as Gome, and that's how I met it many years ago in Ghana. Then I'll talk about Calypso. Calypso came to Ghana and Nigeria, Sierra Leone, around about, maybe not under the name Calypso, but through I think Mark was just talking about soldiers, black colonial troops, who were coming to fight on behalf of the colonialists, but again, miraculously, resulted in creating a model for local Africans on the coast of marching band music by black marching bands, that is, rather than white marching bands. I'll go into this because it relates to the second line and so on in the United States. So then we'll talk a little bit, if I've got time, about ragtime, early jazz, and swing music. So these are some early examples of the return journey. I came across, you know, Mark, when I first came across these ideas, one person I have to mention, Professor Atana Mensah, he wrote a book or an article, I think around about the early 70s, called Jazz Comes Home to Africa. And he was a friend of my father. You know, my father set up the philosophy department at Legon in the 50s. So I had I was standing on the shoulders of some other people. And I must mention F.O. Sutherland, who worked on concert parties and the Black American minstrel impact on the West African concert party. But I myself realized this sort of reconnection simply by being a musician in Ghana. So let me just get into the story, and some of these things will become clearer. I must tell you that I didn't come in as an academic. I wasn't really an academic until I got my PhD in the United States in 1995. And a lot of my original research was just a product of me being a musician and keeping my eyes open and asking a lot of questions. So let me start with gumbe music, or gome as it's called. Now, this is a picture from Jamaica of a gumbe drum. This music appeared in the late 18th century. It's referenced in Jamaica in the late 18th century. It was basically a type of disguised drum. The peg drums were not allowed in, the white slave masters. The last thing they wanted to see is people playing peg drums, because you can use it for communication. But the slaves were able to get around this by inventing a type of drum that looked pretty innocuous, but it kept a lot of African rhythmic features, syncopations and offbeats, as I'll go into. So this drum is an old, well-established drum and a dance that goes with it. And I'll play you an example in a moment. And it's particularly associated with the descendants of the Maroons, the Cromanti people, and so on, who were the people who were a thorn in the flesh of the British colonialists, and who were never able to really defeat the Maroons. They ran away into the interior and set up independent settlements. So now, because of that, the British had made a peace treaty, and they took about 500 or 600 of these marooned slaves. They were freed slaves by this time. And they took them to Freetown in October 1800, and they took with them gumbe music. So at this moment, let me just play you a few snippets of gumbe music from Jamaica. So it's still played there. I even spoke to Rita Marley some years ago about this, because she's partly lives in Ghana. And I was just as a joke, I said, there was a type of Jamaican music popular in Ghana at least 150 years before your husband. And she said, what was that? And I said, well, it's gumbe. And she knew about gumbe, but she had no idea that it had come back to Africa in October 200. This is why I say this pushes the beginnings of the reconnection, which of course had nothing to do with the Europeans. They wanted it to be a one-way journey from Africa to the Americas, and that's the end. But of course, there was this return journey, and this is the very first example that we know of. So let me just play you a few seconds of this. Okay, so it's sung, of course, in patois, Jamaican patois. Now, this is the music that the Maroons, I think it was 550 Maroons, according to Fleming Haref, brought to, or the British brought to Freetown. And let me get you a picture of this. So this is a picture of the gumbe drum played in Freetown. You can't see the thing very clearly, but in this case, the man is sitting on top of the square drum, using the heel of his feet to play the music. This is how it's also played in Ghana. And there's somebody accompanying him on a musical saw, because this type of drum was not a peg drum. It wasn't a hand-carved peg drum. These were much feared, particularly after the Haitian Revolution. The African peg drums were very much feared in the New World because they could communicate for rebellion, and in fact was successful in Haiti. But this was a square drum made by carpentry. So you have to be a carpenter rather than a carver to make this drum. And it was used for this type of recreational music that I've just played. So the British colonialists, they allowed this music to exist. And it in fact spread into, I didn't mention this, it spread into, I think, into the Bahamas, Bermuda, North Carolina, central Cuba. It was because people at that time were looking for forms of music that they could play that could sort of get around the census of the white slave masters. They couldn't play the African drums, but they could play drums which they fashioned themselves, made as sort of square drums. So it got to Sierra Leone about 1800, October. And let me play you an example of this music as played there. Of course, in this case, it's in Creole, one of the Creole languages. That's Creole languages. Okay, so that slight whistling sound in the recording is the musical saw being hit while it's being bent, and it sort of creates a whistling sound. Somebody was asking me, is it Jovia Armstrong? Is it the cajon that they're playing? No, it's not a cajon because it's not purely made of wood. There's a skin. The skin is at the front. In fact, I'll show you some pictures of the drum in a moment. The cajon, there is a drum in Ghana like the cajon, which is made purely of wood, and seems to have originally been a tea chest that was played as a drum. But this is a real drum with a skin. Okay, so then we come to, now I should mention that from Sierra Leone, so this music landed in Sierra Leone, it was very much disliked by the Christianized elites. So the Maroons were sort of the lower echelons of the Creole elites, partly because they weren't Christianized. Most of the Creoles in Freetown were actually highly Christianized. The Maroons were different, so they were sort of the bottom of the heap in terms of Creole aristocracy. So their music was hated, and it was called the mother of all vices. And lo and behold, of course, the mother of all vices spread through half of West Africa. You know, music that's usually got a bad name usually spreads far. This is an example of that. In fact, according to various sources, this music ended up in 14 Western Central African countries, and was taken mainly by artisans, sometimes by fishermen, blacksmiths, carpenters, and so on. And this is where I'm coming to the Ghana story. So I'm only going to concentrate on Ghana here because but the music is found in Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Senegal, Mali, and so on. So it spread from Freetown into all of these countries through artisans during the 19th century. Then let me take the example. Let me tell you how I met this drum. I mean, because this is the drum here again. You can see that this is actually not a piece of wood, but it's a drum head. And the person's got his heel on the drum, so you can alter the tone. So it acts as like a bass drum. And in fact, in my band back in the 70s, which this is a picture of, we used it as a substitute for a bass drum, or as a bass drum, in fact, as a bass guitar. So I was using guitar, and this provided a bass line. And the musicians I was playing with, this is my old Bokor band. The picture was taken at Seaview Hotel in Jamestown. Were Gars. So I took this for granted, this is a Gar drum. But being inquisitive, I found elderly Gar men who told me, no, this drum was brought from the Congo by blacksmiths and artisans, Gar artisans, working under the cruel King Leopold, who brought about, I think, about 5,000 West Africans to his country. Well, it wasn't his country, of course. He never even set foot there. But he needed skilled laborers, artisans, and I don't know, clerks and things like that. So he brought them from English-speaking West Africa. So the Ga people who were sent as laborers, they went on something like a 5-year contract or something, mixed up with the Sierra Leone people. So this is how I discovered that there's a I was working backwards. So I met the thing in Ghana, found it came from the Congo, then discovered through people like Fleming Haref that in fact it came from the Sierra Leone people. And then I found out from people like Ken Bilby and so on, that in fact it was Jamaican. So I walked backwards in time. And let me just play you a little bit of this music. And it's sung in this case in Pidgin English, which was the lingua franca of the English-speaking West Africans who worked in the Congo. So this music basically got to Accra in about the 1890s through the Congo, and then there was a later wave of Gome or Gumbe coming from Fernando Poe. This is research done by Barbara Hampton, and this too has a Sierra Leone connection because Fernando Poe was a Spanish colony that was the British occupied after the Napoleonic Wars, and then they settled. They put a town. A Sierra Leone town, basically. So some Ghanaians returning, fishermen in fact, returning from Fernando Poe in the 1930s, brought another wave of Gome music. In Ghana, it's called Gome music. So basically, to cut it short, this is the first example we have of the return journey of an African-American music, in this case, Jamaican, coming back to Africa and influencing African affairs. And it fed it into many forms of neo-traditional music and popular music. So this is the first example I wanted to mention. So just to put the time envelope back. So the second one I will talk about is the brass bands, this is where the soldiers come in. So brass bands were set up by the British, and they set up what they called native orchestras in the 1830s. This is the first evidence at Cape Coast Castle. And of course, these guys were totally brainwashed by this guy would teach them to play regimental brass band music. So these were Ghanaian colonial troops, in those days called Gold Coast colonial troops. And there's no evidence they ever played any African music. They didn't use the brass instruments to take it in their spare time to develop an African idiom. They just played European time, marches and so on. And then everything changed in 1871. During the Ashanti Wars, the British brought to Cape Coast and Elmina castles approximately, we don't know the exact figure, but approximately about 6,000 West Indians were brought to Ghana in batches of 200 or 300 at a time. So for 30 years, there was a constant stream of West Indian soldiers. And what the soldiers did was that, of course, they played military marches and so on. They were soldiers, so they were forced to do this. But in their spare time, they marched through the streets of Cape Coast and Elmina, playing local music, their local music, that is Afro-Caribbean music. They would use rhythms which were current in the West Indies at the time, like habanera, tresillo, son, and so on. And I guess in America, you will call it the Spanish tinge. These rhythms, which are of Latin or derived, Afro-Cuban music and so on. And also what was a great shock to the Ghanaians. You see, the Ghanaians had met this type of music in the form of European music, in European time, European form of marching, in synchronized time. When the West Indians came marching through the streets, they were using syncopated marches, which is equivalent to the second line in the United States. And this is, in fact, the way Africans move in processional time. So there was a sort of a shock of recognition that this music, I mean, we can only guess, but nobody ever interviewed somebody back in those days. We're talking about the 1880s, 1870s, but suddenly we know that roughly by the 1890s, the Ghanaians were copying this music. They were copying the tunes, the calypso. There's a song called Everybody Likes Saturday Night, which the melody is supposed to have come from the Caribbean. And so very quickly, the Ghanaians developed their own style of music out of this presence of black marching bands coming from the Caribbean. And they called it Adaha music. So let me, in fact, maybe one of the things is I can just show you this diagram here of the sort of rhythm. I mean, this is one of the typical rhythms. It's so common today that we don't even know where it comes from. You could call it a Black Atlantic rhythm. This is the one that goes ka, 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 ka. It's found in the calypso, it's found in Cuban music, it's found in high life, it's found in juju music, it's all over. But the marching groups, that is the West Indian bands, would be using these types of rhythms. And if you look at this rhythm, there are on beats like any Western march, but there are also off beats and a syncopation here, slight displacement. So it has certain African features which resonated with the Ghanaian musicians. So they copied these rhythms, they copied the songs of the West Indians, and then after a while, they used this to launch Adaha music, in which they started to draw in local rhythms as well. So let me just give you an example of this. So this is local brass band music. Well, let me just show you one more picture. This is the earliest picture I've got in my archives of a local brass band that was playing this type of Adaha music. I think the picture was taken about 1890 something, 97. So they look like soldiers, but they're not playing military music. They could play marches and so on, but they were developing the earliest form of high life under the name Adaha music. So the name high life hadn't been invented by then. So it was a direct result of the impact of the West Indian troops in Ghana. And then, now let me play you one more song of this style. So just to reinforce the Caribbean influence on brass bands, this is a popular song by, I don't think he was a composer. It was a folk calypso that was first recorded in the 1920s by Sam Manning. And so this went also into the sort of repertoire of these early proto-highlight bands. And let me just play you this particular song. It's called Sly Mongoose.
Listen to the story why mongoose fled from Jamaica. Listen to the story why mongoose fled from Jamaica. Mongoose, the newspaper reporter, took bed with the preacher daughter, baptized her in his holy water. Slide a mongoose, slide a mongoose. Now your name gone abroad. Slide a mongoose, now your name gone abroad. Mongoose went into bed with kitchen, took up one of his fattest chicken. That's the reason he fled from Jamaica. Slide a mongoose.
So now this is, of course, the American second line. And the point I'm trying to make here to summarize this about the brass bands, and it wasn't just in Ghana. The Adaha was the Ghanaian name. The same thing was happening in Nigeria, but they call it Kalabari music. The same thing was happening in East Africa. They called it Beni music. Africanized forms of brass band music that were derived ultimately from the white military. And the same thing, if you think about jazz, the second line, the marching bands of Louisiana, the training or the style of black marching bands in the United States itself was a product of the returning soldiers from the American Civil War, African-American soldiers, 200,000 of them, that were trained to play regimental brass band music by the Americans, white Americans, but then took it back into the towns and began to African-Americanize it, ultimately resulting in jazz. So it means that on this side of the Atlantic, that is Africa, and on the American side, African-Americans and Africans were able to hijack military brass band music of their colonial oppressors and actually turn military music into recreational music. Or they could do what it says in the Bible. They could turn swords into plowshares, or shears, I should say. So this is a very interesting sort of a miracle, yet another miracle. And I mean, the return of this music to Africa, despite the horrors of the slave trade, was the miracle, because none of this was ever intended by the white colonialists. The reconnection was never intended to happen. It was a disconnection between the two sides of the Atlantic. And through various sort of, well, we've mentioned two, freed slaves and black soldiers, early Caribbean soldiers, returned some of the African heritage back to Africa, and it made a profound influence. And the very last thing I want to mention is, very, very briefly here, is continuing the story into early 1900s, the impact of ragtime music. I can't go into, because I'm running out of time, but just to get, these ballroom orchestras in Ghana in the 1920s were playing ragtime and ballroom music. And you can see a huge collection of banjos here, which was one of the sort of quintessential instruments of ragtime music. So there was a huge ragtime impact on the whole of Africa, South Africa, West Africa, East Africa. Now just do this to prove the point. This is a band that was appearing in the 1920s called the Ragajazbo Orchestra. And this is a program of a ballroom dance with a lot of high up people. And this is the first time we ever see the word high life in 1925. So ragtime is one of the ingredients. It's another ingredient. One is Caribbean music. Of course, African music is the backbone of it, but there are these elements coming in from, correct it. So let me just finish with a couple of slides. We come to the war. I'm just showing, because some of you are Americans, Well, here's a picture of some GIs in Accra, or possibly Freetown in the 1940s, enjoying themselves with beer, but listening to swing music, Duke Ellington and so on, Ella Fitzgerald. And this led to yet another sort of input into highlife music, made popular by this particular person, E.T. Mensah and the Tempos Band. And a number of bands were set up in Accra to cater for the American and British soldiers that played swing. And when the soldiers went home in 1945, 1946, the Tempos survived as a sort of, they'd been trained to play swing jazz. So they sort of added this ingredient to their high life and created the modern, not today's modern, but the 50s modern high life sound that became the sort of the soundtrack of the early independence era. And then it included this musician. This is Guy Warren, who was the first person to play the Afro-Cuban. I mean, we actually know in Ghana, we don't know in many other countries, but we know in Ghana who brought the congas and the bongos. And it was Guy Warren, or Kofi Ganaba, as he was later called. And he was a member of the Tempos, the drummer. So in 1950, he took a journey to Britain, and he was playing with Afro-Cubists, Kenny Graham's Afro-Cubists. There was this big cubop movement at the time. So he learned to play the bongos and came back and introduced Cuban percussion to the Tempos band. So that was the next magical ingredient that made the Tempos the most popular highlife band of the 50s. It wasn't just jazz added to African rhythms and melodies and language. It was also Caribbean, Afro-Cuban music and Calypso music. And you can see they're in a Latin mode there. That's E.T. Mensah playing right in the middle. And I'll just end up with this last song, because this is the song that E.T. Mensah became very popular for in his early days. And it's another rendition of Sam Manning, famous Caribbean song.
I wait you, Papa. I wait you, Mommy. I wait you, Papa. Ooh. All for you, E.T. All for you, E.T.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. Palogo is a Ga word. Somebody's asking me, is it the same as Palongo? That's quite a different thing altogether. Like in Yoruba, maybe Palongo is a different type of music altogether. But Palogo is a Ga music that was invented in the early 60s, and it's based on a fairy story, actually. It comes from one of the princesses in a fairy story. And Sly Mongoose, another question, was a Jamaican folk song, I think. Yes, was recorded by several Trinidadian Calypsonians, I think, besides Sam Manning. But how it got to, actually, that song got to West Africa through records. There is a very early version of it from 1929 in Ghana, played by the West African Quintet. So that one wasn't brought by soldiers or, people from the West Indies. It was actually brought through records. And the last picture sort of, okay, this is, of course, Louis Armstrong in 1956 when he's in Ghana. And this is E.T. Mensah. So this is the song that they welcomed Louis Armstrong off the tarmac at the airport in 1956. So they changed it for All For You, E.T. From E.T. or T.T., they said, All For You, Louis. And then there was a controversy because Louis Armstrong had remembered the song as a Creole melody, and the Ghanaians were insisting it's an old highlife. And all it really goes to prove is that the long connection, the to and fro between the two sides of the Atlantic that's been going on for so long, it's sometimes difficult to say which came first, the chicken or the egg, if you see my point. So it shows that this connection, the Ghanaians were convinced it was an old highlife song. in fact, it was their version of a calypso. And I believe that Steve Feld, I don't know if he's one of the listeners of this program, but Steve Feld told me that, in fact, he went into Louis Armstrong's museum in New York and discovered versions of Sam Manning's song, or not that Sam Manning's, but Sly Mongoose by Ella Fitzgerald and Benny Goodman. So, but it just shows the complexity of trying to unravel the connections between the two sides of the Atlantic. They're so entwined, and they've been entwined for 210 years. This is my main point of this, my presentation. So I'm going to finish there.
Thank you, Prof. Collins. Always such a learning experience to have you speak. And luckily we have his books and his writings really elaborate this in great detail. And we have links to them and even one of his articles, the Jazz Feedback to Africa, really one of the first articles that outline much of what he's talking today, which will be on the website so people can download it. I want to turn now to Professor Arturo O'Farrill to just take 10, 12 minutes, however much you need, and then we can have a discussion also. And then I know, unfortunately, you have to leave, sir, for another engagement, but that's fine. We'll just take care of you first, and then we can continue. So please.
Thank you, Professor LeVine. It's a privilege to be here and to hear these incredible stories that Professor Collins has shared. And I come at it from a different place, but I just want to point out at the very beginning of my presentation that there's a lot of migratory forces at work here and a lot of diasporas. And my diaspora began in the 1700s when the O'Farrill clan left Ireland, left Longford County, Ireland, and found themselves in Montserrat. And then a little bit after that, they found themselves in San Jose de las Lajas, which is Tepoztle, which is part of the Matanzas region of Cuba. But I want to begin my little segment by sharing a story with you. I'm going to share a thing that happened about 2 years ago. I decided I wanted to do a study of a concept first introduced to me by Ned Sublette in his book, Cuba and Its Music, in which he posits that a lot of the information that becomes Northern and West African performance practice also comes from the tip of Spain and the Middle East. And so it got me curious about thinking about how interconnected Spain and the Middle East are to the north of Africa, to the west of Africa, and to make all this migratory passage that makes its way to be music. And in fact, you find a lot of practices in a lot of, especially Afro-Mexican music of a Middle Eastern nature, of the oud, the vihuela, the relationship between all those instruments. But so I went on a fact-finding mission, and I went to Kuwait, because I wanted to present a concert called Cuba Meets Khaliji, the Middle Eastern roots of Afro-Cuban jazz. And I hope that this story is entertaining as well as illuminative of what I'm trying to say. I went to a percussionist's house. Percussion, they have a great tradition of Kuwaiti pearl diving diwans. And I was introduced to a group of percussionists by the presenter who was going to eventually present this concert. So I will share my desktop now and my sound. I hope it works. Yay! So I'm presented to this pearl diving percussion group, and by the man, he says, "This is Mr. O'Farrill. He wants to do a concert here called Cuba Meets Khaliji." And and I began by saying that the center of all our lives was the drum. That the drum came. Certainly the drum was centered around the life of Africa, and I went Africa this and Africa that and Africa this and Africa that. And that gentleman there with the red shirt on, all of a sudden he looks at me and he goes, "Funny, you don't look African." So I was already like, I said, wait a second. Teach me one of your rhythms. And so he began to teach me this very specific Kuwaiti clay pot rhythm that, by the way, you can find in India. I'll shoot forward a little bit. So eventually, much to their surprise, I was able to learn it. At some point, he looked at me and said, "Where did you learn our rhythms? Where did you learn how to play like this?" And I looked at him and I said, "That's nothing. I'm going to teach you guys how to play a mambo and a wawanko." So I sat down at the piano that was there in the house, and let me find the clip. I began to teach them how to go from a mambo to a wawanko. So their mambo, you'll hear it, and then when they switch to double time, that's the wawanko. So at that, it was my turn to say to them, "How did you guys learn to play Cuban music?" Which they looked really, they looked very pleased at themselves. But I realized something was wrong. I was seated at a piano, and most of them were squatting on the floor. And so it occurred to me that there was a kind of a cultural hierarchy that was even physical between Cuban music and Kuwaiti music and African music. And so I said, I looked out of the corner of my eye, I saw a little red piano because the host of the home had a child. And I said, "Bring me that little red piano and let me come down to their level." And so we ended up sitting together and jamming. I'm going to cut to the end. And it was beautiful because all of a sudden the room lit up. There was an incredible amount of energy, and they were all smiling. And I could see walls coming down, just falling apart. And then when I used the little red piano like a percussion toy, that was it. Like all magical jam sessions, it ended perfectly in sync with one another. At which point, the man in the red shirt who had been kind of vibing me, he grabs my skin, he looks at it and he goes, "You're white, but you're black." We looked at each other and laughed and hugged. And that's when I really realized, that this thing is much deeper than I thought. On several occasions, I've seen that the music I play is African in every sense of the word. Though I've never been to Africa, I came at it through the journey of jazz, which is the opposite, I guess, of what Professor Collins was saying. I grew up in New York City. I took classical piano lessons. My father was Arturo O'Farrill, the great master composer of Afro-Cuban jazz, considered one of the founders, really, of that music and one of its highest exponents. And so I grew up around jazz. I grew up around Dizzy Gillespie. I grew up listening to all these men, but for the very first moment that I heard this music was when I heard this piece. I was just a little guy. Let me see if I can find it. I'm going to do the shows. Wait, let me not do that. Let me go back down. Let me bring this down. So the first piece that blew me away was Miles Davis's 7 Steps to Heaven. I'll just play a little bit of that and talk about that experience. I'd broken into my father's record collection, which he kept under lock and key. Prior to this point, I only played Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, and Elton John. And I heard this. I broke into their record collection and put the playing that music on the drums. And I realized that there was something bigger than music. I didn't know it then, but I know it now. I call African the DNA, and a rhythm that is really found throughout Africa and the diaspora. And the very first time I heard this opening solo, I it was that flexibility rhythm that I've been I still didn't understand it. I didn't know that my life would end up where it ended up eventually, because I went on a journey of finding myself. I want to make sure I don't abuse my time. So I'm gonna look at my watch real quickly. Good, I got about 3 minutes left. So somehow what I can tell you is that I learned so much about myself from Randy Weston. Randy Weston, the great Baba Randy Weston, of course, had a club in the Ganawa people in Morocco, and he's the one who actually sat me down and said, son, and I love Randy. He said, you are an African musician. I said, Randy, I've never been to Africa. He said, the music you play, the music that you write, the music you compose, the music that you've tried to codify as part of the real language of jazz is African. And I said, you're right. And so I created an orchestra called the Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra, and I've been finding my way back to that music from the beginning. I wrote a piece that is called the Afro-Latin Jazz Suite that was based on my father's Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite. And I based it off a very specific rhythm. I based it off a specific rhythm that I heard in the Malinka rhythm of the people of Baro. And I tried consciously to connect jazz, big band jazz, directly back to Africa in a way that was very sincere. And so I heard this rhythm. Very specific rhythm that rhythm of day-to-day life, and the way it's performed, the way the rhythm is a sonic rhythm is an extremely important part of African life, and it's reflected in the rhythmic values of African life. And so I specifically took a rhythm, a Malinka rhythm, and put it into a piece of music. And I think it's the first time in some ways that you hear real African rhythms in an Afro-Latin jazz setting. This sounds like this. In truth of fact, in point of fact, everything that I've ever done, everything that I think I've ever achieved as a musician, as an educator, as a human being, is about the journey back to the source of nutrition, really, for jazz. For the book Secular Devotion talks about how everything that we love, rock and roll, salsa, funk, jazz, it all harkens back to very religious rhythms in the north and west parts of Africa. And so all I've really done with my life is I've tried to bring awareness of that. Jazz is not an American invention, y'all. Jazz is not an American invention, y'all. There, I said it. I know it's contrary to the party line. I know it's not what Jazz at Lincoln Center wants you to believe. And I know it's jazz can be co-opted to sell a nationalist agenda. But the truth of the matter is, even Tony Williams, from Tony Williams to Arturo O'Farrill, we owe our greatest debt of legacy to the nation of Africa. And so I leave with the thought that actually everything I do is about going back to a place I've never been. And that is the greatest diaspora of all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor O'Farrill. That was amazing. I think you have a few minutes before you got to go. I don't know, Professor Collins, if you have any thoughts just on the rhythms that you were hearing he was doing, how it impacts some of what, you know, how you relate it to the rhythms you've been talking about, or the rhythms you've heard, or anyone else who when you hear these rhythms, which are very particular. I recognize the Khaliji rhythms, of course, having spent time in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf. But it is true, there's just this through line, and it makes me remember, interestingly, before Africa was colonized, it was often known as Sudanic Africa, what I call the funk belt, basically stretching from West Africa straight across from the equator to the Sahel, right across to Ethiopia, from Senegal to Ethiopia. There's these common rhythms, and that was what used to be known as Sudanic Africa. So it's not surprising that you'll get the African Gulf and African Indian Ocean world having rhythms that are so similar to the West African world. And it's not just because of colonialism, it's because there was a highway basically that went east-west, as well as north, right? And as well as the other Middle Passage, right? That so many millions of Africans who didn't get shipped to the Americas went north to Morocco and Algeria and were enslaved peoples there as well, and made the music like Ganawa that Randy Weston, of course, fell in love with. And I remember actually the first time I really felt like I was in Africa was in Marrakesh. Other parts of Morocco, I never felt it, but in Marrakesh, which was the center of Ganawa, hearing the people playing for hours all the way until dawn at the Jamal Fana, groups and groups of Ganawa troops just playing constantly, like, oh, now I know where I am. And the second time I really heard that was when I actually got off the plane in Ghana. And that was when I realized, boy, these connections are so deep between North and West Africa and across the Atlantic and across the Sahara and everywhere. So it's appreciate your thoughts on that. I know you have to go, Professor O'Farrill, but I hope we can see you again soon and we can share this music.
It's beautiful to be here, and I just love learning from you all, and I'm incredibly grateful to you, Professor LeVine, for inviting me. And also, man, I want to go to Africa. Somebody please take me, please, quickly.
We're working on that, don't worry.
I gotta go, please. Professor Collins, somebody.
For the next
blessings to you all.
Inshallah, as they say.
Inshallah.
Yes, Professor Brown.
Yes. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, we're trying to actually. Okay, Prof Collins. Just for a second, Prof Collins, you were on. I don't know if you heard any of those rhythms that he was playing, and just how what do they bring to mind? Because you have this encyclopedic mind for all the rhythms and where they come from. And I'm wondering what you're hearing when you heard the Khaliji stuff from the Gulf. What did it bring to your mind? Just very quickly.
I had to go out of the house just now. I missed it.
Wow.
There's a huge ruckus right outside my house. There's some articulated dumping stuff. I had to go and check what's going on.
No, that's okay.
Sorry.
I remember the first time I visited your house, there was a Chinese-built road that you were like it was creating that dam, and it was going to break and destroy.
And it did. And of course, it broke. Yeah.
It broke. And by the way, for those of you that don't know, Professor Collins runs an amazing archive, one of the great living archives of African music in his home. And unfortunately, as he predicted it would, the first time I visited him 10 or 12 years ago, there was a paper mill or a wood pulping or something mill, right? And there was putting up this dam, and because of some new Chinese-built road that they weren't putting proper drainage, it just created a perfect storm. The dam burst, the water came through and lost a lot of that archive. But luckily, it's been when we visited again a few years ago, it was somewhat rehabilitated. So thank you for preserving all that. But I know there's always a ruckus on that road where you live.
Yeah, it's a pandemonium place.
It's one of the, Professor Scot Brown, what say you to all these rhythms?
I think they're powerful rhythms. I think they speak to the multidimensionality and nonlinear nature of these movements. They defy notions of time going forward, and they also defy notions of moving in one direction. It's like that adage by Parliament Funkadelic, you can dance underwater and not get wet, all right? And so all of these things are constantly going to reveal more and more stories. So I think as a scholar of funk in a global context, at least in thinking about funk in a global context, we have to be ready for the idea that there will be no real beginning, that every story is going to lead you to another place and time in which there has been some kind of global exchange. And so I think we have to kind of be ready for that, and maybe just sort of temper some of the things we discover to have a notion of an open textured nature to it. I think in the Western Academy, we want beginnings and we want endings. We want the first this and we want, and see, that's not going to work here with sound. I don't believe it will in any case. So that's what I gather from it. Dr. Collins, Professor Arturo's speeches really testify to that. And I want to talk about a latter day aspect of the story that we wouldn't necessarily connect, but I think is very much connected. So why don't I go ahead on the start, if that's okay? Can I get into this? All right, I think I got that James Brown call and response back from Mark. He said, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So what I want to talk about is navigating some of these geographies in a more recent period. And this navigation, interestingly enough, is going to be from Dayton, Ohio to Lagos. All right, but again, this is not a first. Lagos and so many other places in the funk belt, as Mark described it, by the late 1970s, after the sort of famed connection with James Brown and Fela and all of those consequences, there's a whole funk music scene, especially in Nigeria, but not exclusively. I'll play just a few samples of some of those songs and then get into the specific story that I would like to tell. Let's look at this one here. This is the group The Funky. Okay. Again, I gotta move quick because these groups will steal the show. This is my time to shine, all right? So let's go now to the SJOB movement, the song Let's Do It. Jam called Disco Highlight by Orlando Julius. So with the four on the floor, here's a group called Everybody. I see. Come on, everybody. In trouble now. Here's a song called A Brand New Wayo by Big Grill.
Hey man, where is it? It's a brand new Wayo.
So I'm gonna stop there and then come back to it. So this is what's happening in a lot of popular music in Nigeria, roughly from 1976, 77 through to the early 80s. So this is where I'm kind of setting the stage for the story to show that there are already things happening in Nigeria that lend itself to happen. I'm working on a book called Tales from the Land of Funk, Dayton, Ohio, the Bands of Dayton, Ohio, which details the evolution of funk as a local music tradition in Dayton. And one aspect of what makes the bands of Dayton, Ohio, and the bands that are popular in funk is that live performance was the engine that moved the band through multiple public and political spheres. I'll talk about that political sphere as we get into the international. So you have the group Lakeside. I'm going to tell you the story of Lakeside. And this is one of the more well-known songs that really pay tribute to their live music prowess.
Take a ride, there's a party over there that ain't no job. It's live, live, it's all the way live. Don't even have to walk, don't even have to drive. Just slide, glide, slippity slide. Just forget about the troubles in your 9 to 5 and just sail on. That's what you do, just sail on. Now the dude's so funky, hey, what do you think? What is it called? It's called a Lakeside Stank. Come along and ride on a fantastic
Now listen to what he's saying now. He says, I'm the captain.
I'm the captain
of this vessel.
We wanna take you on a cruise all around the land. Music is at hand. We wanna play it for you.
I'm going to talk about that vessel that he's talking about as one that actually crosses the Atlantic in its own very unique way. Mark Woods, the lead singer, is the captain on this song, but there obviously are many captains that lead in this. Solar Records, the Sound of Los Angeles Records, was the most dominant Black-owned record label from the late 1970s through the 1980s. In 1981, Solar was caught in the middle of dramatic changes in African-American popular music as large entertainment conglomerates moved toward establishing dominance over Black consumer markets, leading to a virtual eradication of any significant market share on the part of independent labels. That year, the label, 1981, was caught up in fulfilling a distribution contract with RCA while beginning a new relationship with the Warner Brothers Group. As a result, 3 of its biggest selling artists in 1981 and 1982 released what was called throwaway LPs, to satisfy the contract with RCA, but then move into this new agreement with Warner Brothers. The Whispers, This Kind of Lovin'. Shalimar released the album called Go For It, and Lakeside released the song Keep On Moving Straight Ahead. Let me just play a little bit of the Whispers. Now, these will hardly sound like throwaway songs because these artists don't throw away anything and don't make music that's not good. So, but this was the thinking. This is the Whispers. So I would normally go through all the other acts and their songs, but we're for time, I'm gonna move quickly. But all of those artists, their top artists on Solar, came out with these albums. Lakeside's album was called Keep On Moving Straight Ahead, which we'll come back to by the end of the story. And so I normally would talk about Lakeside's migration from Dayton, Ohio to LA, which is his own story in that map navigating geographies. That's not that much different from the kinds of stories that push music and the sounds through politics sometimes and through all kinds of economic conditions on the continent. But that's another story, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna move quickly. Lakeside signed to Solar Records, as I mentioned. Their first charting single before Fantastic Voyage, All the Way Live, was also a celebration of the performance power through song. And so Lakeside, The Whispers, Shalimar, Midnight Star, Climax, Carrie Lucas, Calloway, The Deal, and Babyface were all a part of that onslaught of music that hit the 1980s that continued an R&B sound, which is able to flourish, and funk sound in a very difficult period of time. Strategically, Dick Griffey, the record label owner, tended to keep the world of selling records and liberation politics in different spheres. Griffey's road to merging the music business with the politics of self-determination is a long and complicated one. But after his discharge from the Navy in '61, he settled from Nashville into the West Adams, West Jefferson district of LA. And he worked as a concert promoter. And by the early 1980s, he had collaborated with Reverend Jesse Jackson's People United to Serve Humanity push, and opened the door for African-American promoters to gain access to large arena tours. The kind of architecture of this high point is the building that Solar Records built, which housed their record studios on North Cahuenga Boulevard. Griffey's focus on economic empowerment was tied to a spirited Pan-Africanist perspective. Prior to the founding of Solar, he had promoted concerts that were, back in the earlier 70s, used to assist and raise funds for Frelimo and the liberation struggle in Mozambique. Griffey also became more fully engaged in Africa in 1980, when he, along with Ayuko Babu, Maxine Waters, and others, mobilized to bring the Guinean dance troupe, Les Ballets Africains, to perform at the city's bicentennial celebration. In making arrangements, Griffey traveled to Guinea with a delegation and met with President Sékou Touré. Politically thereafter, Griffey formed the Coalition for a Free Africa and became heavily involved in the US anti-apartheid movement, working closely with Jesse Jackson, the NAACP, and also was a co-founder of Artists and Athletes Against Apartheid. Los Angeles, as Global Media Center, became a major staging ground for the anti-apartheid movement. So let me move past the anti-apartheid activism and get us to the Lagos story, and I will conclude shortly thereafter. In many respects, Griffey saw Pan-African cooperation as the solution to the kind of racial exclusion with distribution and power dynamics in the music industry in the West. So again, there are politics pushing people. Professor Collins's point about what moved sound, oftentimes what's moving sound is the movement of people, and they're moved by political and economic. There's a political economy of that movement. So he concluded that opportunities for international trade with African countries could generate an alternative to the inevitable pattern of large corporate interests overtaking the independence of smaller Black-owned boutique labels such as Solar. Solar artists were very popular and toured in Nigeria frequently due to close connections between the label and with Radio 2 Nigeria. And also the communications magnate and political figure in Nigeria to this day, Ben Bruce. Lakeside's 1982 show in Nigeria was held at the National Arts Theater, which had 5 years previously hosted the second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture. Lakeside's set list included the hits All the Way Live, Fantastic Voyage, and songs from its latest album, which had just come out, Your Wish Is My Command, with lead singles Something About That Woman and a soulful remake of the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand. After completing a run-through of the show at the sound check, they were confronted by a very, very agitated Ben Bruce, who was extremely concerned about the set list and the show. After a meeting, the band was told that they had to play a throwaway song called Keep On Moving Straight Ahead, the namesake of the Throwaway album. Unbeknownst to the band members, the song was a huge hit in Nigeria, taking on the stature of R&B anthems such as Ain't No Stopping Us Now. It reflected a lingering spirit of optimism in the final year of the Second Republic before the onset of another series of successive drifts toward military rule. And I'm going to play you a little bit of this song, Keep On Moving Straight Ahead, and then conclude. Now you notice it sounds very much like And the Beat Goes On. And that's because Stephen Shockley of Lakeside is one of the co-writers of And the Beat Goes On, which was originally meant for another solo artist, but moved over to the Whispers. So Mr. Bruce left the meeting with Lakeside not knowing that his demand presented a crisis. He didn't realize this presented a crisis for the group. They did not know how to play the song. It was never played outside of the studio recording. It was seen as a B-side at best and more likely to rest among the hundreds of tunes that would never be released. The songwriter, guitarist Steve Shockley ended up teaching it to the other members during the remaining moments of the sound check. The group also decided to open the show by stepping in onto the platform from the ranks of the audience to the steady pulse of a kick drum. Keyboardist Norman Beavers described the feeling as if he had swam through a sea of hands. The stage, Lakeside's most consistent ally, would once again bail the group out of a bind while operating as a dais, undergirded by the hidden politics of a Pan-African ideal and contextual differences in the ascribed meaning and value of a resource that has no parallel in the diaspora and the world, that being Black song. So I'm in here, and then we can talk about, you know, if you like, the implications of that. I think that in many respects, it is a story that has antecedents, it has precursors, it has replicated itself over and over again, and that being not that liberation politics also has been an engine for diasporic dialogue in a cultural way. And so I know that Dr. Collins had talked a lot about sometimes, and even Mark talked about the blood, but also there's also the heartbeat that pumps the blood. And that heartbeat that drives people to try to defy what seems impossible, to try to come together. And that heartbeat in this case is the spirit of Pan-Africanism.
Wow. Thank you so much. That's so amazing. You know, the one thing it reminded me, and I hope Professor Collins can comment on this a bit, is there is so many similar struggles in the African recording industry, right? Trying to open up smaller labels, open up independent studios that weren't owned by a label like EMI or something like that. I've heard there were some smaller independent labels like in Ghana, SC Bones, but there was always this struggle, and the artists, and of course being political, you know, was very hard for most artists.
Yes.
Other than Fela, you know, some artists like Fela didn't care, and their whole persona was the political. So
sure, yeah,
weapon 24/7. But other artists couldn't get away with that, and of course, suffered greatly for it. So it's interesting to see the similar struggles. I don't know, Professor Collins, how that story in that moment in the mid 70s to late 70s into the 80s, are there similarities also going on in Ghana, Nigeria, West Africa at the time about control over, who produces, who distributes, who controls the revenue from the music? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, in Ghana in the 70s, we still had the big companies. We had Polygram. We had a local company, Ambassador Records, but the big companies were still with us. It was only under Rawlings that they sort of started to leave the country. But I wouldn't. There were a lot of independent labels in Ghana, right back into the 50s. Small labels doing high life and so on. So I wouldn't. The real difficulty in Ghana is we only had 3 recording studios. That's it, finished. And at that time we didn't have digital recording or mobile recording. It was just these big outfits, and you had to have steam presses to make records and so on. Big plant. So we had one local one in Ambassador Records, and then we had the Philips one, which was jointly owned by Essibons. Mark, you were mentioning Essibons. I think originally Essibons was a joint venture with Polygram, the Dutch company. So that, that was it. Oh, there was Ghana Films. I have to mention Ghana Films. That was set up by Nkrumah, very fantastic, fantastic recording studio.
Wow.
But if you want to know one of the nails in the coffin of the Ghanaian music industry, whether funk or Afro-funk or anything, it was the overthrow of Nkrumah. That was the beginning of the first nail in the coffin of, because Ghana was leading the way until the overthrow of Nkrumah in many, many ways in West Africa, and including music. So Ghana was the Mecca for Nigerians. I mean, it was by the 70s, it was switching. Like when I went to Nigeria with Faisal Helwani, and we had to go to Nigeria because they had the best studios by then. So there was this switch from Ghana to Nigeria in the 70s, at the very time that Afro-funk was coming up. And I much appreciated your, all the Orlando Julius, for instance. You played a bit of Orlando Julius. Yeah. I mean, he was experimenting with high life and funk back in the late 60s. I think he even made friends with James Brown when he came. And James Brown was a little bit nonplussed, I guess. That here's this guy with his record. I think he called it Afro something, and who was copying who, and who started the groove. Some people say that there's even some guys in Ghana who say that they started funk and it came from the north of Ghana. But these are sort of metaphorical connections, I think.
Abel Taylor, Abel says that.
Yes, and also Ambule, I didn't really want to mention, but Ambule as well says the same thing. That the funk thing actually came from the north, but it's an imaginative reconnection. I mean, what I was trying to talk about in my talk was the actual physical reconnection against all the odds. Even before the political link-up. You see, I stopped in 1950 in my lecture. That was when the more politicization of the musical reconnections occurred, which includes James Brown, Say It Loud, and so on, and jazz, but this anyway, it's a big story. I don't know whether to. I just enjoy listening to the funk from Nigeria because we had the same thing going on in Ghana at the same time.
Yeah. I love to connect with you and just sort of build on those type of connections outside of Nigerian context.
I'll just say quickly before I turn it over to Professor Miller, it's just I remember the story of David Matthews, who was James Brown's arranger. And when they went with Bootsy and everyone in 1970-71 to the Shrine, and basically Dave Matthews was standing behind Tony Allen trying to figure out while I was playing what grooves he was doing, because no one had heard this groove before. It was so complex, and it was like how the hi-hat of a jazz, and then the feed of like of certain kinds of traditional Ghanaian and Yoruba rhythms. And they got really pissed at James. Fella got really pissed because he thought James was there, basically, he was sending his arranger to steal all his moves. But Bootsy in an interview said, yeah, well, everyone thought we were the best band there was, but then we came into the shrine and saw Fella, and we realized that was the greatest funk band on earth. And I think James didn't show up because he probably somehow figured he shouldn't show up there. He might get embarrassed or something. But so many stories, and hopefully Dave Matthews, who I've spoken to, who lives in Japan now, one day will tell that story more. Professor Miller, over to you. I mean, some of these people are people we've been talking about, Randy West and others who've made that trek. How does this fit in with your own work and your own, the stories you've been looking at the past few years about jazz musicians going back?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this awesome panel. I'm sitting up here, mind getting blown and really learning about just how much, my work does kind of fit into, the work of these amazing folks that I really hope I can, stay in touch with all of you and continue to build and learn. Bismillah. So my research really focuses on the history of Black Muslim communities in New York City, in and around New York City over the course of the 20th century. And part of what I want to talk about today is really the relationship between Black religious movements in New York City, as in other urban American centers in the wake of the Great Migration, and increased engagements with African music and culture over the course of the 20th century. It was interesting listening to both Professor Collins and Professor O'Farrill's talks, and again, like you mentioned, kind of hearing some of the same folks that I'm going to mention, and some of the same musical forms I'm going to mention, kind of alluded to. And I think, and Professor O'Farrill mentioned something that I think really resonated with me. What I found is there was a serious overlap between sort of Black religious or Black spiritual seeking and African diasporic and musical exploration. And so sort of the backdrop for the story that I tell in the book that I'm writing is a big part of it is kind of the rise or the emergence of Islam in the early 20th century in New York and other urban centers. And jazz is a big part of that, right? So as folks may know, during the 1940s and 50s, a number of prominent jazz musicians are becoming Muslim, and many who aren't becoming Muslim are nonetheless becoming, Islam is becoming sort of a part of their spiritual ecosystem, right? People like John Coltrane and Art Blakey and Dakota Staten, right? Just to name a few, and I could name 50, right? And during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, some of these notable jazz masters actually traveled to West Africa and engage both the music and the spirituality of the region, right? So again, people like Art Blakey, who goes to West Africa in the early 40s. Some sources say for maybe about a year. And, this alters his trajectory both musically and spiritually, ends up embracing Islam. Max Roach as well, and one of the people Max Roach actually goes to visit when he goes to Ghana is Guy Warren, right? And he speaks his praises, and he's similar to Professor O'Farrill. I kind of wish he was here we could vibe together on this, but he also says, jazz, we need to start talking about jazz as African classical music, right? So Max Roach is very much of the opinion that jazz is really an African musical form. Some of his colleagues disagreed, right? There was an interesting debate he had with some other folks. Also, Aminata Museka, who some people may know more sort of popularly as Abbey Lincoln, right, was another person who became Muslim as a part of this cadre. And of course, Randy Weston, right, who other folks have spoken about his time in Morocco, falling in love with Ganawa music and whatnot. And this phenomenon wasn't limited just to folks who were interested in Islam. This was also true of other Black American spiritual seekers who embraced Akan and Yoruba spiritual paths, along with related traditions of West African drumming and dance. And these interconnected engagements with African religion, music, and history led to the emergence of several New York City-based cultural institutions, right, that sort of come up in my research. One is an institution called the Sankore Nubian Cultural Workshop, which was founded by a woman by the name of, she's referred to as Queen Mother Mariam Samad, right, who was a renowned Garveyite and Muslim, Another was, and there's a professor down at Emory University named Leroy Davis, who I think is working on a book about Mariam Samad. Another, and when I listened to Professor Collins' fantastic presentation, I couldn't help but think about the Akan-inspired Akonede Shrine founded by Nana Yawo Opare Dinizulu in New York in 71. So he's a man who goes to Ghana, spends some time in Ghana in the late 60s, becomes initiated in the Akan priesthood, and comes back and forms this collective, which serves as, a sort of temple for folks who are interested in the Akan spiritual practice, as well as a dance troupe, as well as a sort of school for African drumming. And his son goes on to become a very prominent African drummer as well, by the name of Kimati Dinizulu, who folks may have heard of, who's played with the likes of Sonny Rollins and Nina Simone and Gregory Hines and Dizzy Gillespie and other folks. And actually, I may, if there's time, share a little video clip at the end of him. It's a little 1 minute clip of, I have a couple things I want to share, but if there's time, I may also share a 1 minute clip that I came across of him playing the gombe drum, right? And it's really awesome, really fantastic. And of course, his first teacher is his father, right? Dinizulu, who I mentioned, Apare Dinizulu. And Nana is a term that I think can be translated as chief, right? So when you hear me say Nana Opare, Nana Kimati Dinizulu, this is what I'm saying. Also, you have the Order of Dambala Wedu, which is later known as the Yoruba Temple, founded by Osejimen Adelabu Adefunme, right? Also prominent in New York City. Also operates in the same building as the prominent sort of early Harlem Mosque in New York City. It's an address 303 125th Street. So in the same building, you have the Yoruba Temple, you have the mosque, you have a collective of sort of Garveyite Pan-Africanists, right? So all of these folks are mixing it up, right? There is a lot of cross-pollination going on at the time. And then the last institution I'll mention actually figures more prominently in my own work. It's called Ethno Modes Folkloric Workshop. It was founded by a man by the name of Bilal Abdurrahman and his wife Rakia Abdurrahman. So Bilal Abdurrahman, I'm going to play a little clip from one of his works in a minute. Bilal Abdurrahman is notable for being a set musician for folks like Thelonious Monk and others. But he's really, on the ground, he's really known as an educator. So he was a multi-instrumentalist, spent a lot of time traveling throughout West Africa, him and his wife, building connections and relationships and studying various different instruments, woodwind instruments, percussion instruments, and whatnot. So he became this kind of house musician in New York City who could play all of these different kinds of African percussion instruments. And his albums, he made about 3 or 4 albums, but his albums are unique because they're not albums that are just made for people to enjoy. They're albums that are made for children. They're albums that are made for educational purposes and made to introduce folks in the community to different kinds of African music. And him and his wife, Mama Rakia Abdurrahman, they used this Ethno Modes Folkloric Workshop as a launching pad to do different kind of cultural shows and workshops in the community. And they saw it as a means to introduce people to African culture, to African music, and to Islam. It was sort of their way of giving dawah or sort of painting Islam in a good light, was rather than talking to people about theology, showing people that no, Islam is a part of this broader diasporic ecosystem, right? And this became a way to show people different sort of Islamically inspired styles of dress and whatnot. And so you find this kind of linkage between Islam and a sort of broader kind of African cultural exploration that sometimes you may hear derisively referred to as sort of African cultural nationalism, right? But on the East Coast, unlike the West Coast, and I'm going to talk in a minute about a gentleman who's one of the founders of the East Coast Black Panther Party, the New York chapter Black Panther Party. So in these circles, people saw this kind of revolutionary nationalism, right, and a kind of Afrocentric cultural orientation, and these different spiritual traditions, Islam amongst them, as well as Akan and Yoruba, all as being intertwined, right? And it very much informs the music, right? And so Bilal and Rakia Abdurrahman, they're part of a cadre of folks in New York City that includes Randy Weston, another gentleman who I'm going to play a little bit of if we have time, Ahmed Abdul Malik, who's a bass player who plays with Monk and Coltrane, but makes a number of recordings as a set leader where he's actually engaging the musical traditions of East Africa and sort of the Arab world, right? And so again, sort of understanding this linkage between West and East Africa and this kind of diasporic exchange. And Ahmed Abdul Malik actually famously identified as Sudanese, right? And Robin Kelly has an excellent work called Africa Speaks, America Listens, where he talks about Ahmed Abdul Malik, he talks about Guy Warren, he talks about Randy Weston. All these guys are friends. They're part of this New York kind of crew. Well, Guy Warren obviously, comes for a time, but Randy Weston, Ahmed Abdul Malik, Balad Abdul Rahman, they all sort of grow up around each other and play with one another, and they're all experimenting and engaging these African musical forms in interesting ways. And Max Roach and Abby Lincoln as well. The last thing that I'll mention, because I know we're running short on time, and I do want to at least be able to play a little bit of music, if there's time. If not, maybe we can do that at the very end. But I recently had the opportunity to interview Bilal Sunni Ali, right? And Bilal Sunni Ali is perhaps most notable musically as the sax player for Gil Scott-Heron, right? But this is a man who played, or who sort of learned jazz improvisation from Yusef Lateef, Dr. Yusef Lateef, went on to become a part of this Muslim community, this ecosystem in New York, spent time being sort of mentored and groomed in this Sankore Nubian cultural workshop, but also spent time with folks who were a part of the Akan tradition and whatnot as a student activist, right? And goes on to be one of the founding members of the New York Black Panther Party, right? So in him, you find this sort of snapshot of how all of these different traditions are interwoven, how this sort of spiritual seeking, political organizing, and activism and exploration of music and African culture are all sort of intertwined. And it really informs the music, right? You see how this is really a spiritual, transformative kind of project, a kind of holistic project that's happening. And this engagement in Africa is a part of that. So I think that's pretty much my time. I don't know if we have time to play a couple of clips, or if we should table that. You're on mute, Mark.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, we could do one thing and then we go to Professor Ray, who will bring us home.
Okay. How about, can I do 30-second clips? Two different things? Okay, cool. So I'm going to play, the two things I'm going to play, I'm going to play 30 seconds of Ahmed Abdul Malik's La Ibki, which is Arabic for Don't Cry. And this is a song where he plays alongside Randy Weston. I'm sorry, no, Randy Weston's not on this particular track, but Johnny Griffin is, and I believe Lee Morgan.
Louder.
As loud as it'll go.
Are you sharing sound?
Yeah, you have to have share sound on. See if you can get the share sound on. Let's go to Professor Ray, and then we'll come back and listen to that to end.
Sounds cool.
Okay. Professor Ray.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's been monstrously huge sitting here, receiving all of this knowledge. I just want to say thank you to the ancestors before I share what I have to share today, because it is in their spirit that we get to be here. And I also want to just point to Stevie Wonder's decision to go back to the motherland when we're talking about a new type of gentrification that's going to be happening. The artists go first. So let's understand what that means. Music is revolutionary, but everything is carried by the body. I'm just going to pause right there for us to soak in that truth. It was received, that transmission, through the body. So it's right in the heart. And I also want to, before I continue, just recognize some of the people who I can see are in this space, that are across the waters, across the United States. Brenda Dixon Goshield. What can I say? What can I say? Daniel Avog-Badur, thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. Femi, thank you for being here. Several of my students are here too. There was something very powerful that you just said. I think it was Rasul, when you talked about jazz being African classical music. And that was powerful. I've rewritten my presentation 16 times since we started. So I am an improviser. That is how I move through life. And so I cannot not be responsive. And you also mentioned Yusef Lateef. And so I'm going to share something that just brings us right into the body and that connection. And this is through a work of mine that hasn't been seen for a long time. But nevertheless, I'm going to share it now. Or some of it, at least until we get to the Yusef Lateef. So you're hearing Nyabingi drums. This is a piece that I made in 1998. It was filmed in New York in 1998. I made it in 1994. It was in New York in 1998. The African burial grounds and up at Sunnyside Park in Harlem. It was originally done on stage with a DJ. We were battling our wills. I wanted the tradition. He wanted to give me the breaks. And I started with Nyabingi drums because of my ancestry, which is directly from Jamaica, my most immediate ancestry. So we created new forms of music right in the body. Tap dance. A few years ago when we went to Ghana, it was 11 years ago, Mark, one of my students, a tap dancer, she had a wonderfully enigmatic relationship with Christopher, the lead drummer of the Ghana Dance Ensemble. He was trying to work and mirror her rhythms that she was creating. What was fascinating was that he was seeking to not just embody the time, but the tonality, the sound, the pitch, the cadence of the rhythm. It wasn't simply about beats in space. And so this is something that I've learned even more so in recent times. Also in the audience today is Nani Agbeli, who is my Ewe dance teacher and a master drummer also. So as you can see in this film, I'm going on a journey, and for me it was the journey of the drum. But I later found out through my research in Ghana that it indeed, in terms of Ewe music, it is the song that leads. That the foundation to the music is song. And in the diaspora, we all attribute everything pretty much to the drum. But in truth, the song precedes any music and sets the tone. But also, the drums also take the pitch, the cadence in Ewe music into the drum itself. So the drums are speaking. It's not an approximation. It is a language that the audience can hear. Professor Nketiah talks about prosody. And it's a concept that I've taken into the heart of my work. Because it then enables us to go beyond this notion that these things are separate. And indeed, in many African languages, West, South, East, the word for music and dance are indeed the same word. Event. There's no dilemma. Let's pause for Yusef Lateef. I actually called him up when I was in New York because I wanted him to know about the film, of course, and then potentially to be in it. So interesting. He had no context of somebody dancing to his music. He was very skeptical to begin with. But he later gave permission, and he wasn't in New York at the time. But this is this is an African flute. And again, very much the sound, the flute is speaking. So the full film is 14 minutes, and that's just a little excerpt. So again, thank you for being here. Nani, I know you're here. And so important, this intellectual as well as practical exchange, because many people have been to the continent to study African music and dance. And oftentimes it's not African peoples that get the credit for that, right? So we also have to take account of the power of this music. These are musics and dances that formed revolutions, right? And there's still that same ideas are within these musics that can cause revolutions. And I think we've lost a lot of that because of the economies that drive much of this music. And again, as I was talking to my jazz dance students yesterday, is that in many waves of music development, it's the body that has caused the development, right? Because the music has to be danceable. And if it doesn't cause the body to get into a excitable state that produces something novel, then it has no purpose. And indeed, it's the same thing in Kopea village. I was learning a dance. We were preparing to go to a funeral. And it's also another rhythm similar is used in a dance called kinka. And I have the bell here. I'm not going to play the kinka rhythm, but anybody who's been to a workshop with me, this is how we start. So we learn the time while being able to identify the subterranean rhythms that are implicitly inside of that asymmetry. And it causes all kinds of consternations to begin with. I'm still learning how to balance. But in learning that dance to go to the kinka dance, which we were going to also perform at the funeral, there are some musicians who had come from the United States with Nani under his instruction, and we were doing a little rehearsal of what it was going to be like. And he talked about, okay, this is how the dance goes, this is how the music works. So the musicians were playing, and at a certain point, Nana, or maybe it was Emmanuel, said, no, to the musicians, no. And we're like, whoa, what's wrong? It sounds good. It's like, no, you're not bringing people onto the floor. The music is not bringing the dancers in. So the whole point was, suddenly the music has to have purpose. It has to move the body. And in that same moment, I thought about the DJ. So Scott, I just want you to play music at a party of mine sometime soon. So, because you got me, and so the last thing I'm going to just share with you is that we also have this idea of classical music of Africa. It's powerful. And it made me think, well, if we are going to look at African music as a classical music of its own, then it needs to have its own way of being understood, not through European music theory. And so I would offer that the work that I've been doing, which centers improvisation, don't know if you can see my screen, it centers improvisation through the lens of West African performance. So my research has been centrally concerned with not consuming steps so that I can teach airway dances. That's not my expertise, and it won't be in this lifetime. There are people who have lived that, breathe it, and are indeed the purveyors of it. But there's something else that I've been committed to for as long as I can remember, dancing in the front room with my mother to Jamaican mento. So, and that is improvisation, along with all those other tricks I've learned in dance studios in terms of those techniques. And so what is embodiology? Well, it's made up of 6 principal concepts. Dynamic rhythm being the lead. followed by fractal code, where I'm not going to have time to elaborate, inner sensing and balance, which is the sensory, the felt sense, seselelame, knowing the world through the body, play and decision making, audience proximity. There's always interplay with our audiences, collaborative competition. But really the important part is dynamic. They're all important, don't get me wrong. But dynamic rhythm is important because it's been simplified in the schematics of Western music appreciation. So it's been suppressed. And we need to think about a different set of values that we use to evaluate and understand what it is that we do. And this has also proven, this schematic, which I've called embodiology, has also proven to be generative as an analytical tool. So I can look at a Baptist church service, I can look at a basketball game, I can look at activity that involves interplay, performance, and see how it is generated and how it is being received. I wish I had a chance to play one other rhythm for you, but I think, you know, people have a need to crosstalk, so I'm going to honor that and just say that I'm inviting everybody here, and I am doing that with that sort of prowess of Mother Africa, to be part of an acre symposium where we could do this for the day, plus the day, through the night. We bring the medicine back to the music, the healing, we bring it back to what it was purposed to do besides move units. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wray. I would like to ask, I guess, Professor Collins, because I'm sure you know Christopher, the head drummer. Of course, his shop is literally right near your office on campus in Legon, and I have about 6 of his drums. That remember Professor Wray, all of us bought all his drums. He could have bought a house after we left, because I think everyone bought 5 or 6 of his drums and shipped them home the first time when we were all there in 2010. What an amazing drummer, what an amazing percussionist. That whole ensemble was one of the greatest rhythmic ensembles I've seen. Well, how do you, I mean, just because you've been there for the same thing, working with the Ghana dancing ensemble, how do you hear some of these dynamics that Professor Wray is talking about? You're muted still. Sorry.
I remember we met some years ago. That's right, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
I've been sort of working on, I was going to ask you one thing about this thing about African classical music, though. There's one problem, is in the European paradigm, there's no dancing. And Fela tried to create his music, turn it into a classical music, and he got very annoyed towards the end of his life, and he didn't want people to dance. And if you take dancing out, I don't think it can be called classical music. It's something.
I think you can call it anything you like. You just define it. You just define it.
But
right?
I mean, but the problem with what the Europeans did is they took dancing out of their classical music.
And we see what happened to classical music as a result. We had Bach, yeah. And now we have something else, right? So
well, it died off.
But the dance and the music were together, as was improvisation. It was also a part of how music was developed. Improvisation.
Yes, absolutely, so, yes.
You know, when you try to write everything and put it into those kinds of schemas, you lose some things with what you gain. And what has been lost in terms of the body and the understanding of communication with an audience is great. We know classical music is having challenges now with audiences because that distance and that gulf has continued to grow. It's an amazing form of music, but inject it back. Give the people back the music.
You know, I think that also happened a bit with jazz. Part of what Professor O'Farrill was saying.
Massively. This
debate over, this sort of neoconservative vision of jazz as this very fixed thing that's American, and bebop as kind of the highest level, which of course in so many ways it is in terms of
But the DNA is this DNA of bebop is still danceable, and there are people that dance to bebop.
And I think when
So-
it lost the danceability, it kind of went in a strange place. But some of those guys, Pharoah Sanders and others, they went to the funk, right? There was that part of free jazz that got really funky. Then there's the other part that got so intellectual, it got hard to follow. Scott, yes. You're muted.
Sorry about that. My question was for Professor Ray and everyone about the concept of classical, and if there is a possibility that we are conceptually, that what we're talking about is something bigger than classical, something that could we possibly be, and I've had these discussions with coming out of the Afrocentric tradition as well, that could we be categorically imprisoned by the linguistic and cultural limitations of that word. And it doesn't mean that, of course, I agree with you 100%, Professor Ray. We can call things whatever we want. How we define it is what's most important. But I'm also thinking that there is also a kind of spiritual power in words as well.
Yes.
And I'm just throwing it out philosophically.
Yeah. Sure. And I think this is the first time maybe I've really pondered that today, because Rasul brought it out. So I'd love to cogitate on this even more, because there's this ancestral piece, there's this endogenous coming from nature of itself, not indigenous but endogenous, of its own nature, and I think we're talking about something that is it's wildly powerful. These musics and dances are so powerful. They've reached every corner of the earth, and this constant intertwining is just happening, and it's insatiable. It's not going to stop, because we keep creating. Improvisation is at the heart of it, and that's why my antenna has been pointed in that direction, because those fractals, those repetitions with a difference, right? That's what we are amplifying and diminishing. Don't know what it's called though.
Yeah. Can I just add something? It's interesting to think of this quote, and it's been attributed to Max Roach, this idea of jazz, African classical music, and I don't know all the context, but it's interesting to think about him as a person who comes from this bebop tradition and then is sort of engaging African music more and more, knowing that part of the history sort of a bebop is folks, these black artists, mostly black men who were, sort of virtuosos on their instruments, trying to make the statement that I'm going to make music you can't dance to, because in their context it's like, okay, this is freeing, because I have to continue and make music for a particular style, a particular genre of dance, and I'm that's limiting, so I'm going to break out of that, right? So him emerging from that context and saying
that's what they thought they were doing, but it didn't. I'm saying that we still dance to it. It wasn't the same as the popular dances, but in the DNA of jazz is the body. They didn't turn into playing what John Cage was playing, right?
Right. No, I agree with you. For sure, I agree with you.
Time is still pushing it. It accelerated, sure. And don't forget, there were all kinds of laws that changed the ways in which musicians could show up to spaces to dance, right?
Right.
All of those things impacted the music. It wasn't simply, oh, we don't want anybody to dance, but there were laws that prohibited certain kinds of social activities at times.
Right, for sure.
Constantly also responding to that and being creative, right?
For sure.
Right.
I wonder now if that's part of what Max Roach was getting at, that this is one form within a pantheon of African music that we can relate to a sort of Eurocentric kind of classical music. Because Max Roach also talked about the fact that, sort of sonically, he felt that, and other folks have said this as well, sort of Western, particularly bebop jazz music, had sort of excelled beyond anything else with regard to harmonics, right, and melody. But that African music was light years ahead of what folks were doing in the jazz world with regard to rhythm. And that's why this cross-pollination was so powerful, right? So I'm agreeing with you, but I'm wondering if this is maybe even part of what that statement was a commentary on, right? About,
Yeah.
I think.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think I agree, Rasul, but I also think there's a possibility that what they're saying is more about the social and cultural function. So the only thing that they could see a metaphor in modern music is the role that classical music plays as a sort of protected, guarded space that is seen as something that should be taught across generations. So in many respects, I think what he's saying is more about the role and less about the actual music form. And if that's the case, then I think, again, it calls for more linguistic creativity on our part to express exactly what we're saying. I think that's part of where John is coming from also in that hesitation anyway. I came out of the, the funny thing is that we got to think about the people too. So,
exactly.
I did research on a cultural nationalist group that loved to name things the way they wanted to. And they played at the Brooklyn, the East used to do the big festival out there in Brooklyn, right?
Yep.
And so they called the jazz band African classical music, and nobody came because so there's still a negotiation you have to have with meaning.
So this is why we have to, we have to also think about the genesis and that connection between the body, because if we start, because we've already started on this journey where we're actually separated, we don't study dance and music together. That needs to happen. Just
why that is. By the way, no one came to the show, but they probably got some money from Lincoln Center because they depends what's more important, the crowd or your funding. We only have time, and this should be our last question from Professor Millward from history, who has a very relevant question. Given that music has always functioned as a form of communication, a sanctuary, anti-colonial protest, and fugitivity, to name a few, I wonder if the panelists can speak on the relationship between music and the now global movement of Black Lives Matter. Does music hold a place in the movement? In other words, I guess my added on little question would be, can we imagine Black Lives Matter without the music, without the groove, without the funk, without that joy that comes out of the pain, that moves, that keeps us, that makes it a weapon, makes both weapon and a medicine at the same time? I don't know who'd like to go first. Actually, Prof. Collins, because you're looking at it from an African perspective, and BLM has made its way. I mean, in Nigeria, there's a huge movement now against SARS, against the police that have taken on many, that was inspired by BLM. I don't know from an African standpoint how you're viewing this.
Well,
sorry, I'm literally in a presentation that's.
You got to mute yourself. Oh, I'll mute you. Don't worry. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's some of the Afrobeats musician, not Afrobeat, but the modern Afrobeats have been influenced by Fela. Of course, Fela is so important. He's the best thing I can say is he's a little bit like Mao Zedong had his red book, Gaddafi had his green book. These are political treatises for the various people, that used the sayings of wise politicians. Well, Nigeria has Fela's songs. That's one point I wanted to make. The other thing is that one of the things that's going on in music right now is electronic dance music. It's a massive movement towards dance. It's what Ama was saying about the unification of the body and the music. It's happening. The youth have gone dance crazy. So all the experiments in disconnecting the body from music, classical music, bebop, even the church, the Christian church, it's all been swamped over by this massive amount of dancing that's going on, and one of the reasons that it's relevant to Black Lives Matter because in the sense of Black identity, in that if the world has gone dance mad, how many funk rhythms? I mean, I don't know, Scott. How many funk rhythms do you think there are? Let's say 1,000. There are at least 15,000 rhythms in Africa. At least. I mean, this is a bare minimum. So Africa is actually a huge repository of rhythmic wisdom that's been gathered over hundreds and hundreds of years. And right now is the time for it to hit the jackpot. Because, you know, and I think this is one of the things that's going on with electronic dance. I don't like electronic music. I'm a live musician. I have a problem with it, but I've recognized that it's actually a therapeutic thing that the world needs right now. And where is it coming from? It's coming from Black America and the Caribbean and so on, and now from Africa. For the first time, equalization has occurred in terms of popular music of the world. I mean, we had world music, which was a sort of romanticized Western image of African music. But what's going on now is quite different. It's the realization that a lot of the rhythmic knowledge in the world is actually in Africa. And the world needs it right now for therapeutic reasons, let alone anything else.
Absolutely. Professor Ray, and then
because I have to go to my class. But I would say, yeah, we also need reggae. We also need that healing. We also need, you know, the play of the salsa. I mean, it all matters. And I think the Azunto that's coming from Ghana, and the way that that's also circulating in the hip hop genre. We haven't talked about hip hop today at all, but powerfully present. The musical and the movement vocabulary is coming together. And Dictus is online, I've seen here. So there's a whole wave of movement that, again, is speaking very specifically. It's very much intent on communication, and it is doing so across the airways. Absolutely. And you know, for us to try to count them, I don't know. It feels very Western to count them as opposed to just feel them and know that we're going to keep inventing them. And, you know, onwards. I'm looking forward to this circle again. Thank you.
Brown,
Yeah.
word from you, and then Professor Miller.
So this is a response to the question.
Just your last.
Last point I wanted to make. I posted in the room. Happy birthday, Malcolm X. Malcolm X as Pan-Africanist, and remember, he was a dancer. That's all right, and he was a person of culture. Even if in his political prominence he downplayed those things, he had the kind of instincts that came out of being a musical person. And when he talked about who would he consider the most free people in this kind of hierarchical world that we live in, he said it would be mostly the musicians. And he was talking about the Duke Ellingtons and the jazz bands and the musicians that he met and mingled with on a regular basis. And so that's sort of what I want to leave us with, and that we think and remember that this is still with us to this day. We're not talking about a past, we're talking about a present, and we move to the past in a kind of Sankofa-esque concept of movement across time in all kinds of ways and directions.
Professor Miller, you get the
Sure, and this really builds on what you just had to say, Professor Brown. I was going to say something similar. You know, when we look at Malcolm, you know, again, going back to this idea of like an African classical music and whatnot, you know, Malcolm comes through a stage in his own spiritual development where, you know, he's not necessarily advocating for people to dance and whatnot. But as he evolves, you know, there's a video, I tried to find it for this presentation, but I couldn't find it, of Malcolm, you know, in his later years, still a Muslim after he leaves the nation, dancing to, you know, some of the African drumming at this at Denny Zulu's center, right, where the dashiki, you know, so he got it, right. And with that being said, I think, you know, it's very fitting. We have to, on this day, this blessed day, the day of our, you know, as a Muslim, our sacred martyr and saint Malcolm, may God be pleased with him, you know, in answering, you know, this really fantastic question that my wonderful colleague asked. I think I'm going to come at it a little differently and say, part of what I think made someone like Malcolm special and made that moment special is that he understood the importance for him to be in conversation with Sam Cooke and Etta James, right? And so, you know, often we think about, you know, the music as being sort of a soundtrack to the movement, but musicians are being educated producers of culture are being educated by people like Malcolm X, by the organizers and the theorists, who are in turn listening to and being informed by and taking seriously that kind of musical and cultural work. And so I think to the degree that we can get back to a more integrated kind of approach to this project of our liberation, I think we can kind of rekindle some of that magic.
This has been an amazing discussion, really. I wish we had 14 more hours, or we can make this into a course or take it on the road or whatever, but I'm glad it's been recorded at least. I'll just end, first of all, by saying thank you to everyone, especially you, Professor Collins. I know it's late where you are now, and there's always a ruckus somewhere on the road outside your house. So I appreciate you staying and being part of this. I'll just end with a tiny little moment. The first time I was in Uni Ghana-Legon, and I met Abel Taylor for the first time, and I asked him, "What did you think about James Brown?" He said, "Well, it's all drums. You know, everything he does, it's each part, his horn section, his guitar rhythms, everything used to be just one giant 20-piece ensemble, and each part just got handed out to different instruments." And you know, I didn't know as much as I do now and about just the dynamics of the way funk evolved, and I was so blown away by that. And then I see Get On Up, the James Brown story, with the tragically late Chadwick Boseman, and there's that scene where he's in the hotel room trying to teach everyone that one new groove, which I think is it was one of his first late 60s funk hits, and he's doing that groove, and the band doesn't quite get it. Maybe his papa's got a brand new bag, and he says, "What is this?" Remember, some of you have seen the movement. I say, "What is this?" And everyone goes, "That's a drum." And then he points to the horns. "What is this?" And they go, "It's a horn." He goes, "No, what is this?" And then all of a sudden, everyone in the band gets it, that they're all playing drums, and that everything is a drum in the end. And it just, you know, that's what it comes down to, is just rhythm. You know, the power of the rhythm to cross oceans back and forth and move people for centuries just still blows my mind. I don't know how anyone could be anything else but a musician when you realize that. Thank you all, everyone. I hope everyone who's listening learned a lot. You can go to the website. You can find us from that website that you could register on, and it has links to people's publications and their web pages and the music, and you can certainly reach anyone. I'm sure everyone would love to continue this discussion. I apologize to everyone who we didn't get to answer your question. There were just so many. But keep listening to great music and keep the rhythm going. I hope we can do this again soon. So thank you, everyone. Many blessings, and take care.